The air in the Kanawha exclusion zone had a taste, a bitter metallic tang that coated the back of your throat and never quite left. It was the taste of the blight, the slow, patient poison the newcomers had seeded into the soil and water. The birds had been the first to go, their songs replaced by an unnerving silence that clung to the valleys like the ever-present fog. Now, the trees themselves were turning, their leaves curling into rust-colored claws and their bark peeling back to reveal a strange, iridescent fungus that pulsed with a faint, sickly light in the twilight. They called the aliens the Wardens, a name someone had pulled from a crackling shortwave broadcast before the satellites went dark for good. It was a sterile, bureaucratic name for a sterile, bureaucratic evil. They hadn't come with fire and lasers, not at first. They had come with quarantine buoys that hummed with an invisible energy, fencing off a 100-mile stretch of West Virginia Appalachia. Then came the blight and the quiet. Creeping death it brought to anything with lungs born of earth. My name is Elias Vance, and I used to blast rock for a living, deep in the guts of the mountains that were now my cage and my camouflage. I knew how to break things, how to find the stress points in a rock face and turn it to gravel with a carefully placed charge. It was a useful skill to have at the end of the world. I was scavenging in what was left of Fayetteville when the colors came. The town was a ghost, its clapboard houses sagging into foundations choked with the alien rust vines. I wasn't looking for food. My pack was already full of dusty canned goods and a plastic jug of suspiciously clear creek water. I was after the essentials. In the skeletal remains of a co-op farm store, I found a half-dozen bags of ammonium nitrate fertilizer, damp but usable. In the back office of a defunct quarry, tucked away in a rusted lockbox, were 36 blasting caps. It was a good haul. Gold in a world that had forgotten what currency was for. I was stuffing the last of the caps into a padded pouch when I heard it. A sound that didn't belong in the dead quiet, a high-frequency whine, like a million cicadas screaming on a single, agonizing note. Drones. I dropped behind the crumbling remains of a brick wall, my heart hammering against my ribs. I could feel the familiar cold dread seeping into my bones. A feeling I hadn't been able to shake since I buried my wife and daughter in the woods behind our house. Their lungs turned to stone by the blight. The drones were the warden's eyes, sleek, obsidian discs that floated through the hollows with an unnatural grace. Their single, blue optic sensors sweeping over the decay. They were the outriders for the colors. I peered through a crack in the mortar. My breath held tight in my chest. Down the main street they came. 2 of them, moving with a liquid stride that was both beautiful and terrifying. They weren't soldiers. They were more like exterminators in their gleaming, bone-white armor, carrying long rifles that didn't fire bullets but pulsed with a dull green energy. They weren't here to conquer. They were here to manage, to cull the remaining human fauna that infested their burgeoning garden. And they were not alone. Trailing behind them, herded by the silent threat of the drones, was a small group of survivors. A family, by the looks of it. A man with a hollowed-out face. A woman clutching a threadbare blanket. And 2 small children, a boy and a girl, no older than my own Sarah had been. They shuffled forward, their feet kicking up puffs of reddish dust. My first instinct, the one that had kept me alive for 2 years, screamed at me to stay down, to let the current pass. This wasn't my fight. My fight had ended in a shallow grave marked by a pile of stones, but then the little girl stumbled and fell. A drone swooped down, its blue light fixing on her small, trembling form. The color in the lead turned, its featureless helmet a mask of absolute indifference. It raised its weapon, not with malice, but with the detached efficiency of a farmer putting down a sick animal. And in that moment, something inside me, a fault line I thought had been buried under a mountain of grief and resignation, finally gave way. The rage came on like a flash flood, hot and blinding. I didn't think. I just moved. My mind, trained by years of calculating angles and stress loads, saw the street not as a road, but as a problem in physics. The old town hall stood on the north side, its stone facade already weakened by subsidence and the relentless growth of the rust vines. Above it, clinging to the hillside, was a teetering outcrop of sandstone, a widowmaker that the old-timers used to tell stories about. It was a one-in-a-million shot, a desperate prayer to the god of gravity. I pulled 2 caps from my pouch, crimping their wires to a short length of detonating cord with my teeth. My hands were steady, my mind suddenly, terrifyingly clear. I jammed the makeshift detonator into a bag of the fertilizer, slung it over my shoulder, and ran. I stayed low, using the derelict cars and collapsed porches as cover, my movements a blur of frantic purpose. The colors were focused on their quarry, the process of eradication demanding their full, cold attention. I scrambled up the gully behind the town hall, the loose shale sliding under my boots. The sandstone outcrop loomed above me, a dark shape against the perpetually gray sky. I found a deep fissure near its base, a perfect pocket for the charge. I shoved the bag in, unspooled the wire, and slid back down the hill, my heart threatening to tear its way out of my chest. I took cover behind a rusted-out pickup truck, maybe 50 yards away, and connected the wires to the battery of a small handheld drill I carried. I took a deep, shuddering breath, the metallic air searing my lungs. I risked another look. The color had its rifle leveled at the child. The mother let out a sound that wasn't a scream, but a low, guttural moan of pure anguish. That was all the signal I needed. I pressed the trigger on the drill. The world dissolved into a deafening roar. The blast wasn't huge, just a sharp, powerful crack. But it was enough. The sandstone outcrop groaned, shifted, and then fell. It came down not in a slide, but in an avalanche of multi-ton boulders and shattered rock, shearing off the front of the town hall and crashing into the street with the force of a meteor strike. The colors and their drones vanished under tons of West Virginia mountain. It was over in seconds. The silence that followed was heavier, more profound than before, broken only by the tinkling of falling pebbles and a rising cloud of red dust. I lay there for a long moment, the adrenaline draining out of me, leaving a hollow, shaking emptiness in its wake. The family was gone. I blinked, pushing myself up. They hadn't been crushed. In the chaos, they had fled, vanishing back into the silent, decaying woods from which they came. I was alone, my ears ringing, my body bruised from the desperate scramble. A sharp pain lanced through my side, and I looked down to see a dark stain spreading across my shirt. A piece of shrapnel, probably from the truck, had torn through my jacket. It was a stupid, sloppy mistake. The wave of dizziness hit me then, and the world tilted on its axis. I stumbled forward, leaning against the truck for support, my vision blurring at the edges. I had to move. The wardens would respond to this. They would send more colors, or worse. I had just kicked the hornet's nest with a steel-toed boot. I half walked, half stumbled out of the ruined town, pushing myself into the relative safety of the deep woods. Every step was an agony. The trail of blood I was leaving a stark invitation to whatever might be hunting. After what felt like an eternity, my legs gave out, and I collapsed at the mouth of a dark, narrow hollow, the damp earth cold against my cheek. This is it, I thought, a strange sense of calm washing over me. This is the end of the line. My last conscious thought was of my daughter's face, not as it was in the end, pale and struggling for breath, but as it was before, laughing in the summer sun. Then the darkness took me. I woke up to the smell of wood smoke and antiseptic. I was lying on a cot, a rough wool blanket scratching at my chin. The pain in my side had been reduced to a dull, throbbing ache. A crude bandage, clean and tightly wrapped, was wound around my torso. My eyes slowly focused on the ceiling above me, not the sky, but the rough-hewn timbers of a cabin roof. A fire crackled in a stone hearth nearby, casting dancing shadows on the walls, which were cluttered with traps, drying herbs, and racks of well-oiled firearms. The air in here was different. It still had a faint trace of the blight, but it was cleaner, filtered through some unseen process, smelling of pine and damp earth instead of just metal and decay. "Figured you were dead," a voice rasped from the corner. "Would have been less trouble." I turned my head slowly. An old man sat in a rocking chair, a double-barreled shotgun resting across his lap. His face was a road map of wrinkles, framed by a wild, gray beard and sharp, suspicious eyes that seemed to miss nothing. This had to be him, Jedediah Sawtooth Jedediah, a local legend, a ghost who lived in the deepest parts of the woods, a man who had been practicing social distancing long before the end of the world made it fashionable. "Where am I?" I managed, my voice a dry croak. "My house," he grunted, spitting a stream of tobacco juice into a coffee can by his feet. "And you're lucky Lena found you before the coyotes did. You painted a damn clear trail for half a mile." As if on cue, a woman entered from a back room. She was younger than me, maybe early 30s, with dark hair pulled back in a severe ponytail and eyes that were far too old for her face. She wore a stained lab coat over a flannel shirt, a strange combination of clinical order and backwoods practicality. She wiped her hands on a rag and looked me over with a critical, appraising gaze. "He's awake." Jed stated the obvious. "How are you feeling?" she asked, her voice calm and professional. "Like I got hit by a truck," I said. She allowed herself a small, tired smile. "A piece of a truck. To be more precise, it missed your kidney by about an inch. You're lucky. We disinfected it with moonshine and stitched you up with dental floss. It's the best we can do." She picked up a jar of murky-looking water from a nearby table. "Drink this. Willow bark and ginseng. It'll help with the fever." I took it, my hand shaking slightly, and drank. The tea was bitter, but it eased the rasp in my throat. I looked between the two of them, the grizzled survivalist and the displaced scientist. An unlikely pairing. "I'm Lena," the woman said, seeming to read my thoughts. "I was with the CDC, trapped here when the quarantine went up." "Elias," I replied, my gaze drifting back to Jed. "Jed found me," Lena explained. "His knowledge of this land, the old ways, It's kept a small group of us alive. We stay hidden. We don't make waves. Which brings us to you." Her expression hardened, the brief flash of warmth gone. "What you did in Fayetteville, that was incredibly reckless. Bringing down half a mountain on a color patrol, you have no idea what you've done." "Do you?" Before I could answer, Jed leaned forward in his chair, the wood groaning in protest. He kicked the nest. Is what he did. Stirred him up good and proper. They ain't gonna let that go. That was loud. Boy. Loud and messy. We've survived this long by being quiet. "They were killing a family," I said, my own anger rising to meet theirs. "A little girl. There's families dying every day in these woods," Jed shot back, his voice a low growl. "From the blight. From starvation. From taking stupid damn risks. Your grandstand play might have saved one, but you've just put a target on the back of every soul in this valley. You brought the war to our doorstep." The weight of his words settled on me, heavier than the sandstone I'd sent crashing down. He was right. My single act of rage-fueled defiance had been a firework in the dead of night, drawing every eye. Suddenly, a new sound cut through the air, overriding the crackle of the fire. It was a low, pulsating hum, a deep thrumming that vibrated through the floorboards and rattled the jars on the shelves. It seemed to come from everywhere and nowhere at once. Lena's face went pale. "No," she whispered, rushing to the cabin's single, heavily shuttered window. She peered through a small crack. "They're deploying them." "Jed. They're deploying the spore towers." Jed was already on his feet, his shotgun held at the ready. He moved to another window, his earlier anger replaced by a grim, focused dread. "How many? I see 3 from here," Lena said, her voice strained. "They're blanketing the valley. The blight concentration. It's going to become unsurvivable in a matter of days." She turned from the window, her eyes locking onto mine. The accusation in them was as sharp as any blade. "This is your fault. Hiding is no longer an option. You wanted a war. Elias. Well, congratulations. You've got one." The thrumming from outside grew louder, a promise of the poisoned, accelerated death that was now seeping into the air, into the soil, into the very bones of the mountains. They were right. I hadn't saved anyone. I had just signed our death warrant. And in the sudden, horrifying clarity of that moment, I knew that the only thing left to do was to make sure we took the wardens with us. My quiet, solitary quest for survival was over. I was now the most dangerous weapon this small, desperate pocket of humanity had, and the war for the soul of these dying mountains had just begun. The hum was a physical presence, a pressure against the eardrums that vibrated deep in my teeth. It was the sound of our world being unwritten. Outside Jedediah's cabin, the ever-present twilight had taken on a poisonous, green-tinged luminescence, filtering through the cracks in the shutters. The faint light wasn't from the sky, but from the ground. The iridescent fungus that had been slowly creeping up the trees was now spreading like wildfire in fast motion, its glow intensifying, pulsing in time with the deep thrum of the spore towers. Lena stood by the window, her face a pale mask in the sickly light, one hand pressed against the glass as if she could feel the sickness radiating through it. "They're terraformers," she said, her voice a low, clinical monotone that did nothing to hide the tremor of fear beneath. "The blight isn't a weapon in the way we think of one. It's a tool. It introduces extremophilic microbes into the ecosystem, breaking down native organic matter and replacing it with their own. These towers, they're broadcasting a carrier wave, an accelerant. They've just turned a slow rot into a galloping cancer. She turned to face us, her eyes wide, based on the spore density I was tracking before the grid went down, and factoring in this new amplification. We have maybe 72 hours before the atmospheric particulate count becomes lethal. Less for anyone with a weakened respiratory system. Jed spat a dark stream of tobacco juice into his can with a sharp ping. In English, "Doc," he rasped, racking a shell into the chamber of his shotgun with a sound that was both final and furious. "We're breathing in the damn poison, and the pump just got turned on full blast." He looked at me. His eyes narrowed into slits of granite. The blame was still there, a hard, cold stone between us. "You wanted to make some noise. Boy, hope you're happy with the tune they're playing back." There was nothing I could say. The guilt was a physical weight, pressing down on my bandaged side, making it hard to breathe. I had traded one family's life for the slow execution of everyone left in this valley. I pushed myself into a sitting position, my muscles screaming in protest. "How do we stop them?" I asked, the words raw in my throat. Lena and Jed exchanged a look. It was a glance that spoke of shared hardship and a deep, weary understanding. "We don't," Jed said flatly. "We hide. We got a place. Deeper in the hills. An old mine. Air's cleaner down there. Might buy us some time." Time for what I shot back, a spark of my earlier rage cutting through the pain. To starve in the dark, to listen to the world die on a broken radio. You saw those things. They aren't going to stop until every leaf, every insect, every person in this zone is either dead or replaced. Lena walked over to a large, hand-drawn map tacked to the wall, a relic from the ACE, Geological Survey. It was covered in her neat, precise markings, red circles for known drone patrol routes, blue X's for clean water sources that had long since been crossed out. "He's right. Jed," she said softly, "the mine won't save us. The blight will leach into the water table eventually. We'll be sealing our own tomb. Hiding is over." She tapped a finger on 3 new marks she must have just made, triangulating their positions based on the direction of the hum. "The towers. They're the source. If we can take them down, we might be able to slow the spread. Buy ourselves real time. Time to think. To plan." Jed let out a harsh, barking laugh. "Take 'em down, with what your dental floss, stitches, and my rock salt. There's 2 of you and 1 of me. I've seen what guards those things. Colors. And worse, that ain't a plan. It's a suicide note." He was right, but the alternative was just a slower, more certain suicide. "There are others," Lena said, her gaze fixed on the map. "Jed's not the only one who knows how to disappear in these hills. It's time to call the congregation." Jed stared at her for a long moment, his jaw working silently. The fight seemed to drain out of him, replaced by a profound weariness. He nodded once, a sharp, reluctant jerk of his head. "Get your gear," he grunted, looking at me. "If you can walk, you can carry. You owe us that much." The journey to the gathering place was a descent into a special kind of hell. We moved through hollows and over ridges that I had known my whole life, but the landscape was becoming alien. The air was thick and hazy, catching in the back of my throat, each breath a conscious effort. The rust vines were no longer just on the trees. They snaked across the forest floor, a writhing carpet of reddish-brown tendrils that pulsed with that same nauseating green light. The silence of the birds had been replaced by a new sound, a faint, wet, crackling noise, the sound of a billion alien microbes doing their slow, methodical work of digestion. We arrived at a place called Hawk's Nest, a cluster of abandoned mining cabins nestled in a deep ravine, shielded from the sky by a thick canopy of ancient, dying hemlocks. A dozen or so people were already there, their faces drawn and pale in the lantern light, their eyes filled with a mixture of fear and defiance. They were the ghosts of the valley, a former park ranger named Marcus, whose knowledge of the trails was encyclopedic, a wiry mechanic named Sal, who could coax life out of any dead engine, a quiet, grim-faced woman named Maria who had been a nurse, and a handful of others, hunters and farmers, the kind of people who were too stubborn or too rooted to the land to leave when the quarantine first went up. They all turned as we entered the main cabin, their conversations dying in their throats. Their eyes fell on me, the stranger, the one whose bandage was still seeping blood. Jed didn't waste time with pleasantries. "This here is Elias," he announced, his voice echoing in the tense silence. "He's the reason the sky is glowing and the air is poison. He picked a fight in Fayetteville. Now the fight's come to us." A low murmur rippled through the room. I felt a dozen pairs of eyes on me, judging, condemning. I didn't flinch. I deserved it. But then Lena stepped forward, her scientific authority a palpable force in the room. And because of him, she said, her voice cutting through the noise, "We finally know for sure what we're up against. We know the wardens can be hurt. We know they can be killed. Jed's right. Hiding is over. They've given us a deadline. We either punch back, or we curl up and die." She laid out the plan, or the desperate skeleton of one. The three spore towers were working in unison, creating a resonant field. If we could knock one out, it might disrupt the network, at least temporarily. It was a long shot based on a dozen assumptions, but it was the only shot we had. All eyes in the room eventually turned to me. "You're the blaster, right, Marcus?" the ranger asked. He had a calm, steady presence that seemed out of place in this panicked world. "Vance worked the strip mines up on Gauley Mountain." I nodded. "I know explosives. We need to get you to the base of the tower on the northern ridge." Marcus continued, pointing to a spot on the map. "It's the most isolated, but the terrain is rough. Drones patrol the ridgeline every 30 minutes, like clockwork. And there'll be colors on the ground. I'll need more than fertilizer this time," I said, my mind already racing, calculating, seeing the problem in terms of sheer strength and blast radiuses. The core structure will be shielded, reinforced. I need something with a high brisance, a high shattering effect. I need C4 or Semtex. A grim silence fell over the room. That kind of ordnance was a ghost, a memory from a world that no longer existed. Then Sal, the mechanic, spoke up, wiping his greasy hands on a rag. "The National Guard Armory in Summersville," he said. "They cleared it out when the quarantine went up, but they didn't get everything. There's a secondary bunker under the main depot. Old Cold War stuff. It's flooded, and the electronic locks are dead. But if a man could get in there, that's a 10-mile run through drone country," Jed grumbled. "And the blight's worse down in the lowlands." "We can make it," Marcus said, his jaw set. He looked at Sal. The old ambulance in your garage. Is it still breathing? Sal grinned, a flash of white in his grime-covered face. The engine'll turn over, but it's loud. It'll draw every drone in a 5-mile radius. A plan began to form. A desperate, insane piece of battlefield improvisation. Sal and Marcus would make the run for the armory in the ambulance. A loud, sacrificial diversion. They'd draw the patrols south, towards Summersville. That would give my team a window, a slim one, to move north, towards the tower on the ridge. Jed, Maria, and I would make the climb. Jed knew the terrain. Maria was the medic, and I was the key that would hopefully turn the lock. As Sal and Marcus prepared to leave, the low thrum of the towers seemed to get louder, the green glow outside more intense. A child in the corner began to cough, a dry, rasping sound that cut through the cabin like a knife. The clock was ticking. I spent the next hour working with what little I had left from Fayetteville, packing the blasting caps and the last of my detonating cord. Jed sat across from me, cleaning his shotgun with methodical, practiced movements. He hadn't said a word to me since we'd arrived, but I could feel his eyes on me. "You think this is gonna work?" I asked. Breaking the silence, he finished reassembling the gun with a decisive snap. "Nope," he said without looking up. "Plan's got more holes than a screen door. But it's better than waiting for the rot." He finally looked at me, his gaze hard. "You know how to use one of these." He nodded towards the rack of rifles on the wall. I nodded. He grunted. "Good. Don't expect me to hold your hand. You get us to that tower. You do your job. You miss. You fall. You get shot. We leave you. Understand." "Understood," I said. There was no malice in his words, only the cold, hard pragmatism of survival. We were tools to be used for a job. If a tool broke, you left it behind and finished the job with what you had left. The roar of the ambulance engine starting up was a shocking, violent intrusion into the quiet dread. It coughed to life, a belching cloud of black smoke, and then tore off down the old logging road, its single working headlight cutting a swathe through the glowing fog. Almost immediately, we heard the high-pitched whine of drones altering their course, converging on the sound. That was our cue. "Let's move," Jed commanded. We slipped out of the cabin and into the woods, the three of us moving like ghosts through the alien landscape. The climb was brutal. The air was thin and tasted of rust, and my side was a constant throbbing fire. But the adrenaline, the sheer, focused terror of the mission, pushed me forward. Jed moved with an old man's economy of motion, never a wasted step, his senses tuned to the unnatural woods around us. Twice, he froze, pulling us down into the undergrowth as color patrols swept through the valley below, their white armor ghostly in the green haze. We didn't speak. Every sound was a potential death sentence. After 2 hours of torturous climbing, we saw it. The tower wasn't just a piece of technology. It looked grown. 100 feet of black, chitinous material rose from the peak of the ridge, pulsing with a network of faint green veins. It was surrounded by a perimeter of smaller, crystalline structures that hummed with energy. At its base, 2 colors stood guard, their energy rifles held at a low ready. The sight of it was monstrous, an obscenity against the skyline. It didn't belong here. As we lay there, hidden behind a rock outcropping, my radio crackled to life. It was Marcus. His voice was breathless, strained. "Elias, we got it. A whole case of C4. But They're onto us. They're everywhere. We're not going to make it back. A burst of static, followed by the distinct sound of an energy rifle discharging. We're heading for the old bridge at Carnifex Ferry. Marcus gasped. We'll lead them off. Buy you your time. Just make it count. Vance, make it count. The line went dead. I looked at Jed, his face a grim mask. The diversion had become a sacrifice. Marcus and Sal were buying us our lives with their own. I closed my eyes for a second, the weight of their sacrifice settling on me. I opened them, my vision clear, my purpose solidified into a diamond-hard point. There was no room for grief. Not yet. I pulled a block of C4 from my pack, its texture like clay in my hands. "Cover me," I whispered to Jed, my voice cold and steady. "I'm going in." The silence on the radio was a physical blow, heavier than any sound. "Make it count." The words hung in the toxic air between us, a final testament from a man I'd never met, a ghost whose death I had just authored. Jed's face was stone. He gave a single, sharp nod, a gesture that was both an acknowledgement and a dismissal. There was no time for mourning. Mourning was a luxury for a world that still had a future. Maria, however, crossed herself. A quick, furtive movement in the gloom, a small, human prayer in a landscape that had become profoundly godless. There was no more time for planning, only for execution. The two colors stood sentinel at the base of the pulsating tower, their bone-white armor making them look like sterile antibodies in a septic world. Between us and them lay 50 yards of open and rock-strewn ground, dotted with the crystalline structures that hummed in a low, resonant harmony with the tower itself. "It's a resonance field," I whispered, my mind connecting the observation with a fragment of a conversation I'd overheard Lena having back at the cabin. Something to do with frequency. A detection grid. Jed squinted, his eyes scanning the terrain with a predator's focus. "They ain't tripwires," he grunted. "More like a pond. You throw a rock, it makes a ripple. You move too fast, you make a ripple." He looked at me, then at Maria. "Move like you're stalking a 10-point buck in a dry creek bed. One snapped twig, one scraped boot, and they'll be on us before we can blink. I'll take the one on the left. You," he jabbed a finger at me, "take the right. Maria, you stay behind this ridge. If one of us goes down, you do your work, then you get out. No heroes." We moved, separating, becoming 3 points of a closing triangle. Every step was a deliberate, agonizingly slow process. I placed my heel down first, rolling my weight forward, feeling the ground for any loose shale or dry leaves. The air was thick with the tower's energy, a low-level vibration that made the fillings in my teeth ache. I could see the colors more clearly now, their featureless helmets sweeping back and forth in a slow, methodical pattern. They weren't looking, they were sensing, listening to the vibrations in their network. I was halfway there when it happened. A small tremor, a gift from the unstable mountains, shook the ground. It was barely perceptible, but a cascade of small pebbles dislodged from the rock face above Jed, skittering down near his position. It was enough. The color on the left snapped its head in his direction, its posture changing from passive sentry to active hunter. Jed didn't hesitate. His shotgun, loaded with heavy slugs he'd cast himself, roared once, a thunderous sacrilege in the humming quiet. The slug hit the color square in the chest, Its white armor buckled, spiderwebbing with cracks. But it didn't go down. A deep, grinding sound came from the alien soldier as it raised its energy rifle, the barrel glowing with a sickly green light. The second color was already turning towards me, its own weapon powering up. There was no more time for stealth. I broke cover, sprinting. The C4 bouncing in my pack. The world narrowed to the color, the tower, and the 20 yards of open ground between us. A bolt of green energy sizzled past my head, impacting the rock behind me with a sound like superheated steam. It didn't explode, it dissolved, turning a dinner plate-sized chunk of granite into bubbling slag. I dropped to one knee, raised the rifle Jed had given me, and fired. The 3006 was an antique, a museum piece compared to their weapons, but it hit like a mule. My first shot pinged off the color's helmet, sending it stumbling back a step. My second hit its shoulder pauldron, a lucky shot that seemed to sever a power conduit. The color's arm went limp, its rifle clattering to the ground. Meanwhile, Jed had moved with the speed of a striking snake. He'd dropped his shotgun and pulled a long, heavy skinning knife from his belt. Before the color he'd shot could bring its weapon to bear, he was on it, driving the blade up and under the rim of its helmet, into the softer material of the neck seal. There was a horrific, wet, crunching sound and a spray of something thick and dark that wasn't blood. The color went rigid, then collapsed like a marionette with its strings cut. I didn't have time to be impressed. The color I'd winged was now coming at me, its one good arm reaching out. I fired again, but it was too close. It swatted the rifle from my hands and backhanded me across the face. The blow was stunning, like being hit with a sledgehammer. My vision exploded in a shower of white stars, and I flew backward, landing hard on my wounded side. A fresh, searing pain shot through me, and I tasted blood. Through the ringing in my ears, I saw the color standing over me, its single blue optic a cold, impassive judgment. It raised its heavy boot to crush my skull. Then, a new sound, the sharp crack of a pistol. Maria. She stood 20 feet away, a small revolver held in a shaking two-handed grip, a look of terrified determination on her face. The shot had been wild, hitting the color in its armored leg, doing nothing. But it was enough to make it turn. It took a step towards her, a new, more fragile target. That was the only opening I needed. I scrambled backward, my hand finding the comforting, clay-like texture of a block of C4 in my pack. I didn't have time to set a charge. I ripped it out, along with a blasting cap and a short fuse. My fingers, clumsy and slick with blood, fumbled with the non-electric cap, jamming it into the pliable explosive. I bit down on the end of the fuse, tearing the igniter strip free with my teeth. "Get down," I screamed, and heaved the block of C4 with all my strength. It sailed through the air, an ugly, improvised grenade, and landed squarely in the center of the color's chest. It looked down, a gesture of almost comical surprise, before I scraped the fuse igniter against the rough rock beside me. The fuse caught with a furious hiss. For a heart-stopping second, nothing happened. Then the world turned white. The explosion was immense, a brutal, concussive force that picked me up and slammed me back against the ridge. The sound was a physical punch to the gut. When my vision cleared, there was nothing left of the color but a smoking black crater and a few twisted pieces of white armor. I staggered to my feet, my ears screaming. Jed was already beside me, pulling me up. The tower. Boy, move. He was bleeding from a gash on his forehead, but his eyes were clear and bright with combat focus. I stumbled towards the base of the alien structure. Up close, it was even more grotesque. The black, chitinous surface was warm to the touch and pulsed with a slow, steady rhythm, like a monstrous heart. Green energy, the lifeblood of the blight, coursed through the veins that crisscrossed its surface. I saw the logic of it immediately. It wasn't a solid structure. It was a conduit, drawing power from the earth and broadcasting it. I didn't need to level it, I just needed to sever the connection. I found a cluster of the largest veins converging near the base, a nexus of pulsing energy. I pulled out the remaining blocks of C4, my hands working on pure muscle memory, molding the explosive into a shaped charge designed to cut. To focus the blast inward, I jammed a detonator into the charge and ran the wire back towards the ridge. How long, Jed yelled over the hum of the tower. 2-minute timer, I shouted back, connecting the wires to the battery-powered trigger. We need to be clear. That thing comes down. The energy backlash will fry us. We scrambled back over the ridge, dragging a dazed Maria with us. I found a deep crevice in the rock and pushed us all into it. I took one last look at the monstrous black spire dominating the sky, a cancer on the face of my home. I held my breath and pressed the button. For a moment, it was silent. Then, a low crackling sound, and the charge detonated with a sharp, clean bang. It wasn't loud like the first explosion, but focused, surgical. A brilliant green light erupted from the base of the tower. A deep, seismic groan echoed through the mountain, and the black spire shuddered. It didn't fall. Instead, the green veins flared violently, burning from the inside out. A sound began to build, not a sound of destruction, but a high-frequency scream, like the sound of tearing reality. The tower began to disintegrate, not crumbling, but flaking away into clouds of black dust and volatile green energy. A massive pulse wave, visible as a ripple in the air, erupted from the dying structure, washing over the ridge with incredible force. The rock around us groaned and cracked. The humming across the valley stopped. The sudden, absolute silence was more shocking than the explosion. The oppressive, bone-deep thrum that had been the soundtrack to our impending death was simply gone. For a moment, we just lay there, breathing the suddenly quiet air. We'd done it. We'd actually done it. Jed was the first to move, peering cautiously over the lip of the crevice. "It's down," he said, a note of disbelief in his voice. "The damn thing is actually down." I pulled myself up, my body screaming in protest, and looked out. Where the tower had stood, there was now only a smoking, glassed-over crater and a lingering cloud of green vapor. The eerie, pulsating glow from the forest floor below had already begun to fade, its power source severed. We had cut off the head of the snake, but as we watched, a new sound drifted up from the valley floor. It wasn't the hum of technology or the whine of drones. It was a chittering, clicking sound, accompanied by a low, guttural snarl. It was the sound of something organic, something predatory, and it was close. Jed's head snapped up, his eyes scanning the darkened woods below. His face, which a moment before had held a flicker of triumph, was now a mask of pure, primal fear. "Oh, hell," he breathed. The colors weren't the guards. They were the gardeners. Down in the ravine, a shadow detached itself from the deeper darkness. It was low to the ground, moving with an impossible, insect-like speed, scuttling over the deadfall and rocks. It was followed by another, and then a third. They were the worst things Jed had spoken of. The things that came when the real trouble started. Stalkers. Maria whispered, her voice trembling. They're hunting. The victory had been a flash of lightning in a hurricane. We had silenced the towers, but in doing so, we had just rung the dinner bell. Wounded, exposed, and trapped on the ridge. We watched as the real guardians of the Blight began to swarm upwards. They're hungry. Clicking calls echoing through the sudden, terrible silence. The silence was a lie. It was a vacuum. A brief intake of breath before a far more visceral scream. The stalkers moved with a biomechanical fluidity that was deeply wrong. Their bodies a nightmarish fusion of glistening exoskeleton and what looked like repurposed Warden technology. They were the size of large wolves, but low-slung, with 6 powerful, multi-jointed legs that propelled them over the broken terrain with sickening speed. Their heads were narrow and triangular, dominated by a cluster of glowing red optics and a set of serrated mandibles that clicked open and closed, dripping a viscous, corrosive fluid that sizzled where it hit the blighted earth. They weren't soldiers, they were biological weapons, living engines of death let off the leash. Into the rocks, Jed snapped, his voice a low. Urgent command that cut through my stunned paralysis. Find a choke point. Now there was no path down, only a treacherous scramble over loose scree and jagged outcrops. We half fell, half slid down the back of the ridge, away from the smoking crater, the chittering of the stalkers growing louder, closer. The sounds were no longer just a general clamor from the valley. They were specific, targeted. The calls of a pack that had our scent. I landed hard at the bottom of a small ravine, the impact sending a bolt of pure agony through my wounded side. I gasped, my vision tunneling to a gray pinprick. Maria was beside me in an instant, grabbing my arm, hauling me to my feet. Don't you dare stop. Elias, she hissed. Her face inches from mine. Her fear transmuted into a fierce, desperate strength. Not now. Jed had found it a narrow fissure in the rock face, barely wide enough for a man to squeeze through, leading into what looked like the collapsed entrance to an old prospector's tunnel. It was a dead end, a tomb. It was also our only chance. Innie barked, shoving Maria ahead of him. Give me your rifle. I handed it to him, my hands shaking uncontrollably now that the adrenaline of the attack was wearing off, leaving behind only pain and a deep, bone-chilling terror. Jed took the rifle and my last 2 clips of ammunition. He didn't follow us into the fissure. He turned, braced himself against the rock wall beside the entrance, and faced the ravine. Jed. What are you doing? Maria cried out from the darkness of the tunnel. Buying you time to find another way out of this hole, he said, his voice flat, devoid of any emotion. He wasn't looking at us. His eyes were fixed on the ridge above, where the first of the stalkers appeared, its silhouette a jagged tear against the fading green sky. There ain't no other way out, he added, his voice dropping to a near whisper, as if speaking to himself. But they don't know that. He was making a last stand. He was turning himself into the bait, drawing the pack to his position, to the choke point, so that we might have a few more minutes of life in the dark. It was the cold, brutal pragmatism he lived by, turned upon himself. Go, he commanded, and there was a note of finality in his voice that broke through my pain-fogged haze. Seal the entrance if you can. Don't let my death be for nothing. The first stalker let out a piercing shriek and launched itself down the slope, a blur of black chitin and red light. Jed raised the rifle and fired, The shot echoed in the confined space, and the creature tumbled, its leg shattering in a spray of ichor. But two more were already cresting the ridge behind it. Maria pulled me back, deeper into the fissure. "We have to block it," she sobbed, her hands scrabbling at a pile of loose rock and debris near the entrance. I turned, my heart a cold, heavy knot in my chest, and joined her. We worked in a desperate year's silent frenzy, piling rocks, jamming old, rotten timbers into the gaps, our breath coming in ragged gasps. Outside, the battle was a symphony of chaos. The steady, measured shots from Jed's rifle were answered by the furious shrieks of the stalkers, the sound of claws scraping on rock, and a deep, guttural roar of pain that I knew was Jed's. Then came a new sound, the sharp, metallic clang of his skinning knife against their alien armor. He was out of ammunition. He was fighting them hand to hand. A heavy, sickening impact shuddered through our makeshift barricade. A dark, viscous fluid began to seep through a crack, smoking as it dripped onto the stone floor. They were trying to claw or melt their way through. We piled more rocks, my body screaming with every movement, until the sounds from outside became muffled, distant, and then they stopped. The shrieking, the clang of metal, the desperate fight, all of it was replaced by a wet, tearing, feeding sound that was more horrific than any battle. Jed was gone. The silence that followed was absolute, broken only by our own ragged breathing and the soft, steady drip of the stalker's corrosive saliva eating its way through our wall. We were trapped. The air in the tunnel was stale and cold, heavy with the smell of damp earth and old decay. We backed away from the barricade, deeper into the blackness, using the weak beam of Maria's small, wind-up flashlight to guide us. The prospector's tunnel was short, ending after 20 feet in a solid rock wall, a complete dead end. We were buried alive, with monsters scratching at our tomb door. "He saved us," Maria whispered, sinking to the floor, her face buried in her hands. Her composure, the fierce strength that had gotten me this far, finally shattered. He knew there was no way out. He just gave us this, a few more hours of life, trapped in a cold, dark hole, waiting for the inevitable. The despair was a suffocating blanket. I wanted to give in to it, to just lie down and let the darkness take me. But then I looked at the wall Jed had died to protect. The wall that was slowly, steadily being eaten away. "Don't let my death be for nothing." His last command, anger, hot and clean, cut through the despair. I would not die waiting. I ran my hands over the rock face at the back of the tunnel. It felt different from the surrounding granite, softer, more friable. It was a coal seam. I knew it from my years in the mountains. We were on the edge of the old Kanawha coal fields, a labyrinth of interconnected mines that stretched for hundreds of miles beneath these hills. This prospector hadn't just been digging randomly, he'd been following a seam. "My bag," I said, my voice hoarse. "The detonator is still in it." Maria looked up, her face streaked with tears and dirt. "What? The trigger from the tower? The battery might still have a charge. We're in a coal mine, Maria, and coal mines are full of methane gas." A flicker of understanding, then of terror, dawned in her eyes. "You'll bring the whole mountain down on us." "Maybe," I said, my mind racing, the familiar calculus of demolition pushing everything else aside. Or maybe I can blast us a doorway into the main shaft. It was the longest of long shots. A controlled blast in a potentially gas-filled tunnel with a jury-rigged detonator and no actual explosives was not just reckless, it was insane. But it was better than waiting to be eaten. We spent the next hour preparing. I needed fuel. We had the remains of the stalker's corrosive saliva. It was an acid, powerful and volatile. I carefully collected it in an old tin can I found on the floor, using a piece of my torn shirt to soak it up. Then, I needed a spark. I broke open the flashlight, carefully extracting the small magneto from the wind-up crank. I stripped the wires from the detonator and connected them to the magneto's contacts. It was a crude, unreliable setup. A single spark in the wrong place could ignite the entire tunnel. As I worked, the scratching and dripping at the barricade grew more pronounced. A section of rock near the top crumbled, and a single, glowing red optic peered through the hole, followed by a questing, serrated mandible. We were out of time. "Get back," I told Maria, pushing her into the furthest corner of the small cave. "Cover your head." I placed the tin can of acid against the coal seam. I knew from the sound of dripping water that there was likely a void on the other side. My hope was that the acidic vapor, combined with any latent methane, would create a potent fuel-air explosive. I unspooled the wire, retreating to the relative safety of the corner. My hands were slick with sweat. My heart hammered against my ribs. This was it, one way or another. I closed my eyes, took a deep breath, and cranked the handle of the magneto. The spark arced across the terminals. The result was not the sharp, cutting blast of C4, but a deep, violent whoomph. A wave of superheated air and pressure slammed into us, sucking the oxygen from our lungs. The entire tunnel shuddered, and the rock wall at the far end bulged outward and then shattered, collapsing into a cloud of dust and debris. At the same time, the pressure wave blew our makeshift barricade outward into the ravine in a shower of rock and timber. It was a chaotic, uncontrolled explosion, and it had opened the tunnel at both ends. Through the ringing in my ears and the choking dust, I could hear the enraged shrieks of the stalkers. We had just announced our new location, but we also had an escape route. "Go." Now I yelled, grabbing Maria's arm and pulling her through the newly created opening. We stumbled out of the prospector's tunnel and into a much larger space, a wide, coal-blackened mine shaft, supported by rotting timbers. The air was colder here, heavy with the smell of coal dust and stagnant water. A set of rusted mine cart tracks led off into the impenetrable darkness. We had no light, no food, no idea where we were going. Behind us, the stalkers were pouring through the fissure, their red eyes cutting through the dust cloud, their chittering calls echoing in the confined space of the mines. We ran. We plunged into the absolute blackness. Our only guide, the feel of the iron tracks beneath our feet. Our desperate, improbable victory at the tower had devolved into a frantic, blind flight through the guts of the earth, hunted by nightmares, with the ghost of a dead man's sacrifice as our only shield. We had won the battle, but in doing so, we had stumbled into the heart of the enemy's hive. The blackness of the mine was a living thing. It was a thick, suffocating pressure that swallowed sound and erased the world. Our only reality was the cold, rusted steel of the tracks under our stumbling feet, and the horrifying chorus of chittering clicks and scraping claws echoing from the tunnel behind us. We were running blind, fueled by a terror so pure it had burned past panic into a state of numb, mechanical motion. My wounded side was a galaxy of pain, each jarring step a fresh supernova. But Maria's grip on my arm was an anchor, a relentless, non-negotiable demand to keep moving. The air grew colder, the smell of coal dust mingling with the scent of stagnant water. The tracks curved, and we followed, our hands trailing against the rough-hewn rock of the tunnel wall. The sounds of pursuit seemed to amplify in the darkness, bouncing off unseen walls, making it impossible to tell if the stalkers were 10 feet behind us or 100. Here, I gasped, my lungs on fire. I felt a change in the wall, a recess, the timbered frame of a side passage. I yanked Maria into it, and we pressed ourselves into the deeper darkness, our backs against the cold rock. We held our breath, listening. A moment later, the pack clattered past our hiding spot, a cascade of sharp, metallic sounds and guttural clicks. They didn't slow. In the absolute dark, they were hunting by sound and scent, and our stationary silence, combined with the confusing echoes, had made us momentarily invisible. They were moving too fast to track us precisely. But they wouldn't be gone for long. They would realize their error and begin a systematic sweep. We had bought ourselves minutes, nothing more. My mind, stripped of sight, was working with a desperate clarity. Minds weren't just tunnels, they were systems. They had ventilation, drainage, and junctions, and they had weaknesses. We can't outrun them, I whispered, my voice a dry rasp. We have to stop them. Here. Maria's breathing was a faint, trembling rhythm beside me. With what? Elias, we have nothing left. We have the mountain, I said, a plan solidifying in my mind. A desperate piece of geological warfare. I saw it on the old survey maps back at the cabins. This shaft intersects with the lower levels of the old Gauli mine. They used to have problems with ventilation. I didn't have to say the word. She understood. Methane, the invisible, explosive ghost of every coal miner's nightmare. We turned their hunting ground into a trap. We found it a few hundred yards deeper into the mine, a four-way intersection, a nexus of tunnels that felt more open, the air carrying the faint, rotten egg smell of swamp gas. High above, I could just make out a dark circle against the slightly less dark ceiling, a primary ventilation shaft leading to the surface. It was perfect, a natural chimney to focus the blast. I need a wire, I said. Something long. Maria didn't question. She rummaged in the small medical pack she still carried, the one she'd used to stitch me up. After a moment, her fingers found it a spool of copper suture wire, thin and delicate, but a conductor nonetheless. It was meant for closing wounds. Now it would be used to open one in the heart of the earth. The work was agonizing. I needed to create a spark, a trigger, at the heart of the intersection. But we had to be far enough away to survive the blast. We tied the delicate wire to a small rock and, with a desperate prayer, I hurled it across the junction, aiming for the opposite tunnel. It clattered against the far wall and fell. We held our breath, but the stalkers didn't respond. They were still casting about further down the main shaft. I carefully stripped the ends of the wire and connected them to the terminals of the magneto, the last remnant of our desperate fight. I gave the crank a single, gentle turn. Nothing. The circuit was too long, the wire too thin. The resistance was too great to generate a spark. The chittering was getting closer. They were coming back, moving more slowly now, more methodically. It's not working, I said, the words tasting like ash. A cold, Final despair began to settle over me. We had come so far, only to fail in the dark. "Wait," Maria said, her voice sharp. She pointed towards a dark stain on the tunnel floor near our feet. Water was seeping from the rock, pooling along the iron tracks. "The water," she whispered. "It's full of minerals. It's conductive." It was a wild, desperate long shot, the kind of thing that existed only in movies. But we had nothing else. We moved, our time running out. We followed the trickle of water back down the tunnel, away from the intersection, finding a spot where the tracks were submerged in a wide, shallow pool. This would be our trigger point. We submerged the stripped ends of the magneto's wires into the pool, a few feet apart. The theory was insane. The electrical charge would travel through the water, down the tracks, and arc across a small gap we had created in the rails at the center of the intersection, igniting the methane-rich air. The sounds were on us now. The first stalker appeared at the edge of the intersection, its red optics cutting through the darkness. It paused, its head tilting, sensing the methane-heavy air. Perhaps understanding the danger, it let out a low growl, a warning to the others. But it was too late. The rest of the pack, driven by the bloodlust of the hunt, crowded in behind it, a writhing mass of black armor and clicking mandibles. They saw us. The lead stalker shrieked, a sound of triumphant fury, and the pack surged forward. "Now, Maria," I said, my voice eerily calm. I held the magneto. She placed her hands over mine, her strength joining my own. Together, we cranked the handle, hard, for a single, eternal second. The world held its breath. Then, a faint blue spark flickered across the rails in the distance. The reaction was not an explosion. It was an ascension. A silent, terrifying ball of blue flame blossomed at the intersection, instantly consuming all the oxygen. It expanded with a deep, gut-wrenching whoomp that was more pressure than sound. A wave of pure, incinerating force that rolled down the tunnels in every direction. The firestorm hit us like a physical fist, a blast of scorching, oxygen-starved air that threw us back against the rock wall and then was gone, leaving a vacuum in its wake that threatened to pull the breath from our lungs. The mine screamed, timbers splintered, and the ceiling of the intersection collapsed in a deafening, grinding roar of 10,000 tons of rock. The fire, the stalkers, the intersection itself, all of it was buried, erased from existence. We lay in the suffocating darkness, our ears ringing, our bodies bruised, but alive. The tunnel ahead of us was gone, sealed by a mountain of rubble. The hunt was over. We had brought the mountain down on our pursuers. The climb out was a slow, painful crawl through the ventilation shaft, a vertical journey back toward a world we weren't sure still existed. After what felt like an eternity of scraping over rock and rusted iron ladders, we saw a pale, gray light filtering down from above. We emerged, gasping, into the cold, damp air of the dying Appalachian morning. We were on a ridge overlooking the valley. The world was quiet. The oppressive, humming dread was gone. The sickening green glow had receded, leaving behind a forest that was scarred and blighted, but no longer actively being poisoned. The air still tasted of metal and decay, but it was a taste of aftermath, not of an ongoing execution. It was the first true silence I had known in 2 years. In the distance, we saw movement. A small group of figures, the survivors from Hawk's Nest, were making their way towards the base of the ridge. They had seen the tower go dark. They had waited, and now they were coming to see what was left. Lena was with them. Her face, when she saw us, was a mixture of disbelief, grief, and a flicker of something that looked like hope. There were no celebrations. We told her of Jed, of Marcus and Sal. The names of the dead were spoken into the quiet air, a litany of the price that had been paid for this one. Silent mourning. You did it, Lena said, looking not at me, but at the horizon. Where? Far to the east and west. Two other faint. Malevolent glows still pulsed against the clouds. You've shown us it can be done. The war was not over. We had not won, but we had given them an answer. We had taken their sterile, silent poison and answered it with fire and rock and the sheer, stubborn refusal to die quietly. I looked at the faces of the survivors around me, the mechanic, the nurse, the ranger, all of them broken, all of them exhausted, all of them still standing. I thought of my wife and daughter, of the quiet grave in the woods. The grief was still there, a permanent part of my own internal landscape, but it was no longer a tomb. It was a foundation. The wardens had made a critical miscalculation. They had invaded a land that was already haunted, a people who already knew how to live with ghosts. They had come to a place that knew how to break things, how to find the stress points, how to turn mountains to gravel. They thought they were culling a dying world. They had no idea they were just waking it up. My name is Elias Vance, and I am a blaster, and my work has just begun.